Topic 8 is called A Memorable Moment. While Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard. And she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was this ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." This is an extraordinary story of faith. It's an extraordinary story of, in Mark's Gospel at least, the first Christian believer, the first person who really demonstrates deep faith in Jesus. Now, Simon, of course, is socially dead, like the bent-over woman. He's an outcast. He's a pariah. And there's no way that Jesus should be going to the house of Simon the leper. Just as there was no way that he should have reached out and embraced the woman who was bent over, so there is no way that he should cross the threshold. There's no way that he should be sitting down. There's no way that he should be eating with the utensils. And there's no way that he should be eating the food of somebody who is a leper. So Jesus not only does that, but he takes his disciples as a kind of captive audience. And one can imagine that they would not at all be pleased. There's nothing in it for them. There's no honor in it for them. And they've been, as it were, dragged along to the house of Simon the leper, and they're not too pleased about it. And we can see this because when the woman comes in, they presume to interfere. They are guests. They are not the host, and they have no business to be interfering. Jesus is the chief guest, and Simon the leper is the host. The disciples' job is to be quiet and gracious, and they are loud and ungracious. This is an example of how the men sometimes are the negative blueprints for discipleship. This is an example of how the men come to discipleship, but by the long way round. So Jesus is identified here quite explicitly as sitting down. It's a sign of deference on the one hand. He comes to Simon the leper, Simon being an outcast, a nobody. Jesus is enhancing Simon, A, by crossing his threshold, and B, by sitting down in his presence, so that at least he's at the same level as Simon, but not in a superior position. However, when the woman comes in, she's standing. And therefore, when the woman comes in, her head must be higher than Jesus' head. And that places her in the superior position. It is exactly the same, and it's not inconsequential. It's exactly the same as what happens with the woman at the well. John's Gospel in chapter 4 tells us very clearly Jesus is tired out by the journey, and he came to Jacob's well and sat down. And a woman came to draw water, which places her head above his. She's in the superior position. He is in the inferior position. So he then looks up literally to the woman and says, "Give me a drink." And she looks down on, literally, Jesus. And she says, "You, a Jew, ask a drink of me." So this positioning is very, very important. So the woman is in the superior position. But also, of course, given that she's in the superior position, she can then anoint his head because she's got to be higher than his head. And when we come on to the question of the symbolism of anointing the head, it becomes very, very different from the symbolism of washing the feet. Washing the feet requires the person who is washing the feet to place their head lower than the person whose feet is being washed, in the subordinate position, therefore. And to wash a person's feet is the act of a slave, the act of a servant. So in the other stories, in Luke and John, where Jesus, where the woman comes in and washes Jesus' feet, she is in the inferior position. And given that she is characterized as a sinner, it's appropriate for her to be in the inferior position. But in this story of Mark, she is not characterized as a sinner, and she's in the superior position. That gives a completely different twist to this story. So Jesus is sitting at the table, and then a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. The words are very, very important here. She came with an alabaster jar. It wasn't glass, and it certainly wasn't plastic. It wasn't something that was easily disposable. It's alabaster. And alabaster itself is very costly. And alabaster is very, it will break and shatter. You can't kind of put it back together if it breaks. In other words, this is what is usually referred to as conspicuous consumption. She's going to go all out. She's going to pour it out. She's going to waste it. She's going to have nothing left. Which leaves us again with a few questions that we can reapply to our own lives. This is a story of a woman who comes out, risks, is courageous, and comes out publicly. So the question for myself is, do I dare to take the kind of risk that she takes? Will I come out in public and do that which needs to be done in justice? Or will I hang back? Or will I simply keep quiet? Do I have the courage of this woman? Secondly, she clearly made preparations. She knew what she was going to do. She had a very good strategy. And the question for me is, do I prepare to meet Jesus? Or do I just kind of wander through life casually? Do I have a focal intention? And do I prepare with a sense of purpose to meet Jesus, whether it's in my prayer or whether it's in Eucharist? Thirdly, do I have the kind of trust that she had, that Jesus would not just spurn her or repudiate her? She trusted that Jesus would see the integrity of her act, and indeed he did. Do I have that faith? Do I have that trust that if I do my very, very best, it will be acceptable? Fourthly, the woman did all she could. Could I say that of myself? Do I do all I can? Do I do everything I can? Or do I just do a minimum? Or maybe do I do very little? Or simply complain? Or do nothing? She did all that she could. What about me? And the final question relates to what Jesus says of her at the end. What she has done will be told in remembrance of her. There was something mightily important in this woman's witness, something that was worth being remembered and recalled for 2,000 years. After I'm off and passed through this life, is there anything in my life that would be worth anybody else remembering? Is there any legacy that I have as a disciple of Jesus?